So it's a busy day in Old Jerusalem. One of my modern theological favourites is Marcus Borg. And Borg is a professor at Oregon State University and is a very distinguished biblical scholar. In a book he has co-authored with John Dominic Crossan, Borg suggested that there were two processions going on in the city that day. There was a great Roman procession coming from the west. Pontius Pilate at the head of a file of Roman soldiers. And this procession used horses, it had glittering weapons, the whole power of the Roman Empire was being displayed, clattering through the streets, bringing a sense of absolute, utter, arrogant domination. And this procession was noisy and visual. It was restating a reign that was bloody, brutal, and maintained by fear across most of the known world. The other procession started on the Mount of Olives. It was a much smaller affair, probably a dozen people. There was a donkey at its head, and cloaks and branches were laid down along the road. That was quite a contrast. Here came one who was coming in the name of the Lord, quiet, profound, proclaiming the peaceful reign of God. We need to be able to understand what it was about this Palm Sunday procession that started Jesus inevitably on the way to a cross at Golgotha. Clearly, this is about challenging political and religious power. And if we don't see that immediately, then we're going to see it very shortly when Jesus throws the money changers out of the temple. The people who were drawn to the procession maybe couldn't know it straight away. After all, it was just another spectacle in a city of spectacles. But if Pilate's procession at the other end of the city was proclaiming worldly power, then Jesus' procession was threatening to pull it down. Please hold that thought. 2, well, that's still in the temple. The story is told about the way that God's people do business. We talked all about this in the sermon a few weeks ago. But remember that the abuses in the temple most directly oppressed the poor and the vulnerable. You can't read the story of God and Israel without knowing that it is precisely the poor and the vulnerable that God holds most dearly and most closely. There is, as is often said, a special place in God's heart for the poor. And that message Jesus repeated time and time again. Palm Sunday 2009, it's been a week of different processions, especially if you live in London, as processions of the most powerful people in the world made their way to the G20 summit. And processions of protesters making their way into the city of London. What are we to make of that? Jesus' procession on Palm Sunday was about pulling down the mighty, not simply because they were mighty, but because they had forgotten that they had to care for the poor. Simple as that. No room to interpret it in any other way. Who says the gospel isn't relevant to modern life?